I loved his idea first how to start this, so that's why I'm using his right off the bat. So defining ethics, what is ethics for you? And so again, check your As You Learn for this. So defining ethics. Ethics are systems of value and custom in a society. Now, we all have a system of society when it comes to the way we treat morals, opinions, values, beliefs, that kind of thing. And we have a sense of what's right and what's wrong, what's in the gray area. And it's really interesting how different countries perceive this area of ethics versus other ones. So I'll give you an example. One, one of the more interesting areas of entertainment industry is always the rating principle of what is it considered to be 13 years old, and what does that imply when you watch something versus you need to be 18 years old, and that makes it so you can watch something, or play something. So we have this through video games, we have this through movies, for example, and one of the more interesting news stories was I got a report from was it the not the Daily Show, it was Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, and one of the things he talked about was this area where he was talking about 50 Shades of Grey and saying that the movie, for a lot of people, they wanted to bump up the restrictions for who was able to watch this. But all of these countries were kind of on board with this and saying, let's make it that much more difficult to watch and make it only for mature audiences. But whereas one of the differing countries that felt like this was not the case was France. France said they actually lowered the rating to PG-13, and it's interesting of areas where we find, so we could say Western cultures, more specifically within the United States, we have a culture that has a lot of violent content on media, and that can be considered socially acceptable within our culture. Now, I'll talk about countercultures in a minute, but the sports we watch, for instance, the movies we watch. So, I understand that when so I like watching hockey and college football, and those are very violent sports. I like watching Game of Thrones on television. That's a very violent show. And again, is this something that's considered right or wrong in this case? And you have to kind of weigh this area of, do we consider something, where is the point where things get cut off? I mean, this is why I'm assigning what I did. It goes the same with shock comics, for instance. So a lot of us have talked about Tosh.0, and when is it not funny anymore? When is it bumping up against the line where people are going to say, this is ethically wrong? And it's always interesting that I played and had friends that have played Cards Against Humanity at one point, and so we would look at the cards from an ethical consideration, and I was doing this with a bunch of people who got their PhDs in philosophy, and they say, when does it stop? When does it stop being funny in terms of shock? So there was that example that I used with violence, but then we can look at a lot of the European countries, for instance, where sex and sexual content on media is actually considered a lot more acceptable than other countries. They again, it's not something that is a big a deal as we make it out to be here in Western culture. So this is a major consideration. Now, with this, we have to also consider that within ethics, in terms of value in our society, that there is counterculture. So there is the majority. So, for instance, I'll give you a really bad example here. If you live in the state of North Carolina, the culture that usually comes with it in terms of sports, for instance, is college basketball. You like Duke or UNC, maybe NC State, and there's a handful of other universities such as ourselves that are put into the mix. But it's college basketball, Tobacco Road, Duke, UNC. Those are the main two. Those are the ones we talk about. But there's counterculture, and I usually find myself in counterculture within this in particular. I like college basketball. I don't like pro basketball, but I like college basketball. But I went to Virginia Tech, so I am a fan of Virginia Tech. I go against that culture. Now, there are other things that we can say within culture. Different things come about. So, the idea of face, for instance, saving face, social etiquette, social capital can exist in different parts in this country and be more emphasized in different parts of this culture here. So ethics is an area of philosophy concerned with the study of ethics in metaphysics and other areas of human thought. So again, you can see some of the key words here in terms of what is it that we say within our culture this is considered right. What is it within your family that you consider right? What is it within yourself that you consider right? And those are areas that dive deeper and deeper and deeper in terms of what shapes your personal philosophy. Because I guarantee you there are bits and pieces that aren't your own. They are influenced by something or someone else. So this may be a parent, this may be a friend, this may be the culture that you live in that shapes that ethics. And I want you to think about that when you're doing your as you learn question here in your form, is think about what is it that shapes the way I think about this? Why is it that I believe this way? Why is it important that this is my ethical consideration here, here in this particular instance? So applied ethics is taking what you have in terms of your ethical considerations and applying it. And you see here applied ethics, professional studies such as bioethics, medical ethics, journalism ethics, business ethics. For us, it's academic ethics. This is why we have the Institutional Review Board. So I don't remember going through the roster of anybody that had my research methods class, that you have to go through a protocol as an academic to make sure that your research is going to be considered ethical towards whoever the group is that you're studying. So we're dealing with human participation. And one thing that has always been talked to me about is, a professor told me, it's like, you can really screw up somebody's life if you're doing these ethics incorrectly. And so in this case, for us, it would be, where does science stop? And where does it become something that's actually hurting people? When does our scientific inquisitiveness stop, and where does it come into the fact that we need to think more morally that this may be wrong? And so this is, I have to ask this question. I might even put this up as a discussion board this week. I haven't really decided if I wanted to yet, but is advertising ethics an oxymoron? And for that matter, strategic communication, because the goal is to make sure that you're promoting your product in such a way that is going to make yourself look good and want people to buy. Now, in its core, that doesn't sound like necessarily a bad thing in terms of advertising ethics here. However, you might want to consider high-risk products. People consider cigarettes high-risk products, alcohol high-risk products, firearms high-risk products. And this is usually how they're defined. Well, video games now could be considered a high-risk product, depending on who you're talking to. And so, but with this, we have to take into consideration about the idea of, think about advertising ethics within tobacco. If you are inherently saying that tobacco is morally wrong, you might consider advertising ethics to be an oxymoron. However, we do have this instance where for anybody that will be in the National Student Advertising Competition, I don't know the client yet, so I'm just letting you know. But whatever the client may be, you might have ethical issues. So we had, I think it was in 2008, we had Coca-Cola, to where people said, I cannot endorse this product because, one, in the case study, they were specifying that they wanted to advertise this to children. And this is a sugary drink. People consider it highly addictive. Whether it is addictive or not, that's on you in terms of how you feel about it. I'm not going to get into my personal opinion on that, but again, this is where ethics comes into consideration and where people might say this is an oxymoron because you're promoting a product that you might have ethical qualms against. So that can be very difficult. So how do you do it? Do you do it? If you're a major advertising firm, do you take on this client knowing the risk and knowing your ethical procedure here? And that's tough. Because in a lot of ways it's not practical for organizations to introduce some high-level ethics and ethical considerations here. But also, it is one of those areas that, again, you as a person, you have to go through a little cognitive dissonance to say, can I justify these actions given my ethics, or do I have to change my ethics? And that's something we can talk about a little later. So ethics versus law here. Now, ethics, we can talk a little bit. So I'll talk a little bit about advertising ethics here. So we see law as a binding custom or practice of community, rule of conduct or action prescribed, formally recognized as binding or enforced by a controlling authority. I know that's very riveting. But ethics, a principle of conduct governed by an individual or group. Okay, so differences, we see compliance, applicability, and punishment. Similarity, laws reflect society's prevailing moral values and beliefs. Some laws mandate ethical conducts and embody ethical principles. So law, in this case, is interesting because we have to abide by it. So for advertising specifically, we look at a governing organization called the Federal Trade Commission, also known as the FTC. So the FTC is federal trade. They look at this area of advertising in particular. So if you advertise something, we have to take into a lot of considerations of what the FTC says. Now, granted, we'll talk a little bit about, not today, but we'll talk about what is it about the FTC, what are their requirements, what are some of the things that bump up against the line in terms of what the law is. And so we can take, for instance, that the FTC, let's go back to high-risk products because we'll be talking a lot about high-risk products in this class. Let's take cigarettes, for example. The FTC requires that there is a Surgeon General warning that is listed on their packaging. And it has to be, and their advertising for that matter. They also can't advertise in certain places. But there has to be a graphic that has the words of the Surgeon General warning to say that this is an unhealthy product and there is a varying risks that are undertook if you engage in the activity of smoking cigarettes. So that's over here, that's law. That's what we're dealing with here in law. You could consider ethics. Now, granted, I'm not saying that this is an ethical company or area of companies here, but I'm saying that this is self-regulation. So this isn't really done by the law itself. It's just we're applying this here. So one thing that the alcohol industry did was they chose the line, please drink responsibly. And for please drinking responsibly here, we can say that this is an ethical consideration because they self-regulate themselves. So every advertisement per the alcohol industry has to come in with please drink responsibly. So if it's something that we abide by, that we say we're self-regulating, and that there are other things that are within the law, we can follow within law and ethics. I mean, the same thing can be said for actually consuming alcohol within a commercial itself. That is considered unlawful. It is against the law. And, you know, that is something that needs to be taken into consideration when you're doing alcohol in advertisements. So that's kind of law and ethics within this Venn diagram here. So again, you'll see here some ethical, unethical behaviors are not illegal, but they are against rules that we establish as a culture within this university. So cheating on exams, lying to friends, adultery. Now granted, adultery can be a little bit tricky in that case in terms of some laws that go into it. And the same with cheating on exams. Our laws, our bylaws state that you cannot do that. Otherwise, we will report you for it. But some illegal behaviors are not considered unethical, such as speeding. Speeding is a good example. I am a person that I speed when I drive, especially because I drive 105 every day. So you can probably just imagine with a lot of these slow drivers how frustrating that can be. Okay, so there is that. So why advertising ethics? Well, first and foremost, if you are in advertising, you're not in a respectful profession. And that's one of the reasons is because the whole term persuasion is largely looked at as a negative consideration. So you can look at some of the terms like manipulation or coercion as these definitions for what persuasion is in this case. And that's difficult to kind of go against here because we're looking here that advertising practitioners, lobbyists, can all be considered within our profession, and we're towards the bottom. And again, that's a tough row to hoe here because we're saying to ourselves, how do we make ourselves seem like we are promoting in such a way that we're not coercing or we're not manipulating? And when you go into the definitions and really dig into what persuasion is, we would say that when we use persuasion, we are giving the audience the freedom of choice to do something or not do something. So I'm not manipulating somebody by promoting an advertisement. I'm just saying this is what's here. We encourage you to buy it because we like this product. However, it's on you if you actually want to do it or not. That is a freedom of choice. I can choose to watch this, engage in the message, retain the information, and then go out and purchase said product. Or I can ignore it. I can write against it. I can do a lot of things. I have that freedom there, and this is where it's difficult within the ethical considerations of where, personally, I don't consider a lot of advertising to be unethical. I do think there are some unethical advertisements for sure, but personal beliefs here is I don't really consider advertising as a whole to be unethical because this is an area where we're dealing with persuasion. You have the option as an audience member to choose. If you didn't have that option, or you were being manipulated to choose something, then we've got a different scenario here. And it's mentioned here within like Mad Men as a TV show, but also Lobbyist. You can watch Thank You for Smoking, for instance. And I sincerely hope you watch that movie. It's a very, very interesting movie in terms of how lobbyists come into play here. Other things, need to become a ethical practitioner of advertising, help us better understand advertising critics and their criticism, defend us, people who work in this about advertising criticism. Again, the nature of persuasion mentions what it is that we're trying to do. A lot of people have ethical qualms with the idea of demographics as a whole in terms of putting people into areas of saying that these are the people who are most likely going to purchase this product. And a lot of people have trouble with that. This can be demographics as far as race, as far as age, as far as sex, where people get really upset because you are aiming towards a certain audience, and it's true. In fact, there was an advertisement recently for, I think it was like a truth advertisement against anti-tobacco, and it featured the problem that there were advertisements being delivered. So this is media planning here, to areas that had large African American communities. And the message of it was, this is a form of racism, that you are promoting these ideas within this group. And also talking about low income. So it was not only racially, but also socioeconomical status, not inherently the same within this advertisement, because there was a lot of different races that were shown within the framing of this advertisement. But what we're dealing with here is we're talking about the one thing I looked at was I found it interesting because I said this is how a lot of advertisements actually do things. It's not just cigarettes. It's, we can look at other products that say, I mean, you can look at other channels. If you watch television, that would say women are more likely to watch this channel. Men are more likely to watch this particular channel. Certain ages are more likely to watch this channel and so forth. And so, again, this is a tough consideration to say, is this a form of racism, sexism, homophobia, that kind of thing, ageism, where we're talking about the criticism that are involved. Because, again, does this exist as a whole within advertising? And again, this is the argument of, is advertising ethics an oxymoron? So again, all things to be thinking about. Development of your moral character, promoting virtues. And you can look up, Aristotle has a whole mess of virtues here. Honesty, perseverance, courage, integrity. How can we make our advertisements work more towards that? And this is why I think a lot of advertisements have moved towards what scholars call corporate social responsibility. That basically looks at, we're looking to help our community because we're a part of this community. We're looking at helping people who are in our community, people who are within our organizations or employees, maybe the environment, that kind of thing. So the moral character is promoted through how you apply it and things like the way you advertise and how you do that kind of thing. Okay. There's a lot of criticisms here. I'm not going to go into them. You can read these. You can pause the video. But again, these are some of the criticisms of the harms that might happen. So individuals, the aggregate of advertising as a whole, the lack of role of consumers and appropriateness of advertising. We're going to talk a lot about that. Role of advertising as a force, undermines our culture, profane nature, again, etc., etc. We have a lot here. And again, this is something that I'm really going to make sure that everybody understands when they're going through this class, is that we're going to be talking about a lot of very heavy topics. And it's important to really try to remove yourself as much as possible from the argument and approach it and say, again, what do these narrative frames say? And how does, and then we can go a little bit into our personal beliefs here and our personal morals, our personal ethics, and say, how might this be looked at? Because again, my ethics are going to be different from yours. So I'm going to try, when I teach, to back off as much as possible and let the content speak for itself. However, the content that's going to speak for itself is going to be very controversial. So again, please take that into consideration when we get into this as well. Again, that was part of his lecture here. So again, this is what we're dealing with in terms of the beginning of advertising ethics. Take everything with a grain of salt. Really think things through, especially when you're getting into your case study. And what is ethics? Really think about what you're writing, what you're using, what you're saying, and that will help you as the first step to making a good choice in terms of what you're writing. So again, we're dealing with a lot of heavy topics. Make sure you do things that are in such a way that are respectful to others. And if there's anything that I mention within these lectures, and if you aren't in agreement, if you hear something that may upset you for one reason or another, send me an email. Come visit my office and let's talk about it. I want to make sure that this is a class that we don't step on each other's toes as much as possible. But I realize, again, given the controversial nature of a lot of these topics, that might happen. And I don't want it to happen. So again, I'm just going to try to let the material speak for itself. But if it does cross over the line in your mind, reach out to me, and again, talk to me, and we'll see what we can do